Hi, everyone. I'm Walter Stern. Thanks so much for joining me today. And I also want to thank LSU Press for hosting this event. Very excited about the opportunity to connect with people online. Given the isolation of the last few months, it's really nice to be able to join with people, even if it is through the uh, computer, in order to um, discuss my work and really looking forward to the questions that you all might have. I'll start by just introducing myself briefly. Um, I was born and raised in New Orleans. Spent most of my life there. Currently, I'm an assistant professor of educational policy studies and history at the University of Wisconsin in Madison. Um, Here I teach and write about the history of American education, as well as urban history and the history of the civil rights movement. As in the book that I'm going to discuss today, a lot of my teaching and research focuses on issues of racial inequity, racial inequality, how it was constructed over time, and also the strategies that people have employed historically to fight racial inequality and pursue broader understandings of justice. Today I'm going to be reading from and discussing my book, Race and Education in New Orleans. I always like having props on hand. So this is the paperback edition of the book that comes out tomorrow. The book was originally published a couple of years ago. And I'm going to begin by just giving you a brief overview of the book, and then sharing a couple of passages from it. So one or two passages, depending upon the time. I want to make sure I have opportunity for you all to receive your questions that you might have. My book tells the story of how schools shaped the racial order and urban landscape of New Orleans from the founding of the city's public school system before the Civil War up through the Jim Crow era. I look at street level battles, backroom negotiations, boardroom deals, and show how decisions about the locations as well as the racial designations of schools gave real world meaning and value to the fictional concept of race. Race is a made up idea, no grounding in biology, but over the course of hundreds of years, race has been given great power through actions, and I focus on the role that schools played in giving meaning to race on the ground in New Orleans. A lot of the book is a story of how ordinary white people, as well as powerful business and governmental institutions, constructed and institutionalized white supremacy. It's about how they used the power of government to grant resources and opportunity to people who are racialized as white, while denying those same resources and opportunities to people who are racialized as black. Thinking about the book in terms of a phrase that's gotten a lot more use recently, it's really a story of the construction of systemic racism, of how racism became systemic and how it became built into the very fabric of a city like New Orleans. But my book is also a story about black people contesting this process by using the limited power that was available to them during the period I cover to build and sustain communities, often at great odds. Power is very central to the story, as is race, and how those battles were fought in the venue of schools. So how did schools build and maintain white supremacy? How did schools, as I write in the book, create a segregated city? I'll give you a very high-level overview to give you a sense of some of the main themes of the book. During the period that I cover in the book, stretching from largely the period the decades prior to the Civil War up to the start of school desegregation in New Orleans in 1960, during this period, black and white New Orleanians competed for limited public resources. And that competition was fiercest among the poorest residents, among working class residents. across the city, white residents broadly embraced deeply rooted ideas from the real estate industry as well as popular culture that linked race to property values. And these ideas put forward that the presence of Black people negatively affected property values. And so acting on these ideas as well as other racist ideas, white residents consistently opposed and often violently opposed the location of schools for Black children near their homes. The school board, which during the period I'm looking at was entirely white, well, I should back up. Most of the parts I look at, the school board was entirely white, the exception being the Reconstruction era. The school board responded, as politicians do, to the demands of residents for keeping white residents, for keeping Black schools from their homes. And the board did a number of things to essentially retool the racial geography of New Orleans, using schools as key chips in this process. So the board concentrated Black schools in the oldest, most neglected sections of the city, targeted those areas with high concentrations of Black populations. And it's important to remember that up until or through the first decade or so of the 20th century, New Orleans, like most cities across the country, was actually more racially mixed than it was segregated. There were pockets of isolated Black communities, pockets of isolated white communities, but there was a lot of residential integration across the city, and the school board played a significant role in reversing that. So the board concentrated Black schools into these older, neglected areas. The board also built new schools for white children in new areas of the city. And often the school board would enter an area before houses had even been built, and essentially use schools to claim an area for white residents. I talked about how this process unfolded in some ways was a form almost of colonialism, in those kind of claiming territory for certain people and denying access to others. As the board was moving into newly developed areas, federal housing policies, particularly New Deal housing policies like the Federal Housing Administration, supported these moves and supported the advance of residential segregation. The school board also collaborated with both federal as well as city officials in linking together segregated public housing and segregated schooling. I end the book by talking about the construction of the Desire Housing Project and multiple schools within and adjacent to that project, all of which were for African Americans, and which purposefully were trying to isolate African Americans in a rather undesirable section of the city in terms of access to transportation and the quality of the land. One other very important thing that I'll highlight is just a sort of overview of this process. As the board was retooling the racial geography of the city and really making very purposeful decisions about where Black schools would go, where white schools would go, they would convert the racial designation of schools during the period of segregation. As this was happening, resources were being allocated in very, very uneven ways. This was true certainly in schooling, where Black residents during the Jim Crow era generally paid far more in taxes than they received back in school funding for their children. But there were resources from other parts of the city as well as from private industry that were being dispersed in incredibly inequitable ways, and schools really influenced that allocation of resources. So in areas that got white schools, resources often followed those schools. These resources were the form of investment in modern sewage systems, paved streets, sidewalks, zoning protections that prevented industrial or commercial activity from those areas. And all of this served to boost the property values, artificially boost the property values of these areas with white schools. This was also happening when there were racially restrictive covenants that were blocking Black residents from moving to those areas. And the opposite often happened with areas that got Black schools. Those areas that had Black schools, they weren't just not given investment and resources. Often they were very directly targeted for redevelopment. because they had a black school, because they were perceived as being black, and in areas that had a black racial designation were viewed as less valuable. And a key example of this would be the areas sort of surrounding the present-day Superdome, where one of the most valued and significant schools in the city's history, the Black McDonough 35 High School, was located. And so all of these moves essentially made this racial theory of property value a reality. It was based on racist presumptions, but official policy gave it real-world meaning and action. So I shift to the passages I've selected. And again, I'll start with one. If there's still time, go to a second one. And I want to give some more examples because I realize that what I've set up to this point might give the impression that white supremacy was the product or is the product merely of racist policies implemented by misguided, if not downright evil people. And that's really just a part of the story, if only a part of the story. This process was much more complex. And so the passages I've selected hopefully give a little bit more insight into how white supremacy was constructed as well as how it was contested. And I was thinking about current events when I picked these passages because both in different ways address the role that political violence played in enforcing white supremacy. So the first passage requires just a little bit of context. It also speaks to how the very ways that we understand and make sense of the past influence and justify actions in the present. And so to give you a sense of all this, I'll introduce you to a man named James Forche. If there's a central villain in my book, it's James Forche. He was president of the Orleans Parish School Board in the early 1920s, and he played a leading role in using school buildings to reshape the city's racial geography. His professional work was closely tied to the real estate industry, and as president of the school board, he actively sought to deny resources to Black people and Black communities while shifting them to white people and white communities. Forche's father was the famous historian Alcee Forche, and the passage I'll read, I examine how both James and Alcee Forche's understanding of what came to be called the Battle of Liberty Place influenced their approach to politics. The Battle of Liberty Place was a Reconstruction era battle, really a coup d'etat, an unsuccessful one that the Democratic White League launched in 1874 to try to overthrow the elected Republican Reconstruction government of Louisiana. And there's a monument celebrating these white supremacists that was on the streets of New Orleans until just a couple of years ago. And I mention all this because in these school battles that I look at, people who are pushing for removing Black schools from anywhere near white residents regularly referred to the Battle of Liberty Place to support what they were doing. And it came up in one example that is referenced in this passage, a 1923 fight by white residents and led by James Forche to kick Black students out of a school, the Bayou Road School, where a new building had been constructed to replace the one that was just in deplorable condition. And I will turn my attention to this passage, and I'll pick up with the superintendent of schools unveiling his building plan after World War I to meet the great need for new schools in the city. So the building program the superintendent wrote in the summer of 1920 needed to consider, and he said, this is a quote, the current distribution of population and present and probable future directions of growth. And so I go on to write, while forecasts about the city's growth were a necessary, if imprecise, part of the planning process, the Broadmoor neighborhood provided the school board with an opportunity to put their fingers on the scale. Sorry, I'm going to back up. I turned to the wrong, excuse me, turned to the wrong page. That was the second passage I want to get to, which I'll hopefully get to in a second. Let me pick up with the Battle of Liberty Place and James Forche. So my apologies for that. The Battle of Liberty Place provided Alcee and James Forche, like other participants and their offspring, with a point of reference and justification for later reform activism, however bare-knuckled it might be. Alcee, for instance, took up arms alongside other Battle of Liberty Place veterans as a member of the Young Men's Democratic Association, whose paramilitary squads monitored the polls and guarded ballot boxes during the 1888 municipal elections. The Times Democrat newspaper referred to the Democratic Association's victory over the city's working-class political machine that year as a bloodless 14th of September, whose results was just as great and equally as necessary to the substantial prosperity not only of the Crescent City, but likewise to the cause of reform and good government. And the 14th of September was the date of the Battle of Liberty Place. Alcee Fortier also contributed to another silk-stocking victory over the political machine in 1896, when the son of a White League veteran was elected mayor. Alcee passed the lessons of Liberty Place on to James, who recalled studying alongside his father at the dining room table in the family's Esplanade Avenue home, which was located a mere 6 blocks from the Bayou Road School. The mosquitoes that buzzed around the dining room's large oil lamp and the overflowing bookcases, hand-hewn by the slaves of James Fortier's great-grandfather, provided the backdrop for these nighttime sessions. The elder Fortier often continued writing at the table after his children finished their lessons. What a furious activity he had, James Fortier recalled years later. His energy was so tremendous that the table used to quiver and shake under the driving power of his pen as it crashed over the paper. The impact of the father's teachings was evident in the political activities of his son. The strongest evidence that James embraced his father's teachings came from the Louisiana State Museum's 1938 Official History of Reconstruction, which the younger Fortier edited while serving as president of the museum's board. Titled Carpetbag Misrule in Louisiana, the pamphlet placed the White League and the Battle of Liberty Place at the center of a valiant and ultimately successful effort to restore white dominance in the Pelican State. Viewed in this context, James Fortier's comment during the January 1923 debate over the Bayou Road School that he was, and this is a quote, that he was unwilling to do anything that would affect the white man's supremacy, and that he was ready to deny the Negro political equality, and if necessary, resort to force to do so, appeared to be more than overheated rhetoric. Between World War I and World War II, neither Fortier's interest in the supposed horrors of Reconstruction nor his commitment to the armed defense of white supremacy were unique to New Orleans. As evidenced by the widespread popularity of the 1915 cinematic epic Birth of a Nation, which valorized a patriotic Ku Klux Klan's eradication of post-Civil War Negro rule, a broad swath of white Americans shared Fortier's beliefs. And this stretched all the way up to the top academic historians of the day. From Birth of a Nation to Gone with the Wind, the reimagining of the Civil War and its aftermath is a tale of white gallantry, regrettable political conflict, and shared suffering enabled white Southerners and Northerners to reconcile their differences. In the process, they erased the war's relation to slavery and black liberation. For W.E.B. Du Bois, the consequences of this sort of rewriting of history were clear. It's not only part foundation of present lawlessness and loss of democratic ideals, Du Bois wrote, it has, more than that, led the world to worship the color bar as social salvation. Against these great odds, Black New Orleanians sought to lessen their degradation at the hands of the state. And I'll just bring things to a close in the next minute and then open for questions, so I won't go to the second passage. I'll just say what that passage addresses is how these policies affected Black families. And I focus on one particular family in the Broadmoor neighborhood in which one of the younger sons of the family discussed how not just the street level violence and school policies, but also the role of police enforced white supremacy in New Orleans, and how his parents stood up and resisted that. So I'm going to stop talking here. I would love to hear questions that you all have and you enter into the chat, and so I'll look forward to fielding those. So I see one question that says, as far as you know, is this style of maintaining white supremacy, being the education system, common in the South? And the short answer is yes. New Orleans obviously has a reputation for being unique. It was, of course, the largest southern city for much of the period I'm talking about, prior to World War II. But like many other cities, particularly southern port cities, Savannah, Charleston, as with northern cities, you had a shift over the 20th century from relatively integrated cities residentially to very, very segregated cities with decisions about school locations often playing a significant role. Other historians have written about Raleigh, North Carolina, work on Atlanta, showing how similar processes like the ones I describe in the book took place. And also in northern cities, particularly in response to the first and then second Great Migration, there was similar decisions about not just locations of schools, but drawing school boundaries in very creative ways to isolate Black students in certain schools, keep other schools strictly for white students, and to try to protect or reinforce residential boundaries as well. So someone has asked whether this is a New Orleans map on the wall behind me. It is. As I mentioned, I born and raised in New Orleans. My family and I lived in New Orleans after college and elsewhere for 10 years before moving to Madison. And so to feel like we brought New Orleans with us, we, in a very painstaking way, and I have to admit I did not do most of the work, but we brought New Orleans to our home and painted it on the wall. So it seemed a fitting backdrop for today's conversation. So great question. Did I find anything interesting about New Orleans' education system in my research that didn't end up in the book? I found out that I could go on for at length about this. Probably the best way to answer it is to explain where the research started, because where the research started did not end up in the book at all. I actually set out to write a history of education in New Orleans from desegregation forward to Hurricane Katrina, and began by looking at desegregation at the high schools, where I found one of the exciting and not entirely expected things that I found was the extent of conflict, of violence within schools, which is maybe not all that surprising, but often tied to that violence and conflict in the high schools was significant amounts of student activism, particularly activism on the part of Black students who, during the process of desegregation, and this was again quite similar across the South, across the country, found incredibly inequitable conditions within desegregating schools, increased police presence, discriminatory disciplinary policies, and often organized protests, walkouts, and other less formal forms of resistance to challenge that. And I thought that would be the start of the book, but in researching how the segregated high school system developed in New Orleans, I kept finding these examples of decisions about location and construction of schools and racial designation of schools being very closely tied to broader discussions about the future of neighborhoods and whether a neighborhood would be white, whether it would be Black, what resources were there. And that kind of took over the research. but I'm now returning to those themes that did not end up in the book, looking at desegregation and looking at the way violence between students or from police against Black students played a political role in shaping desegregation, and then also looking at the politics of how Black students responded. And some of that work focuses on New Orleans, some on other parts of Louisiana, and then I've also been trying to look a little bit more broadly across the South as well as the Midwest and Northeast for that project. So great question about when the shift to parochial schools happened in New Orleans. So there as a city with a very large Catholic population, the Catholic school system was deeply rooted in New Orleans, and so I would say there was sort of less of a clear shift with Catholic schools than with a Catholic school system growing up more or less alongside the public system. The Catholic system developed a little bit later toward the latter part of the 19th century, whereas the public school system began in 1841. Public system began as a whites-only system before briefly integrating during Reconstruction and then segregating after 1877. And I look a little bit at the book at parochial schools to see whether Catholic schools, parochial schools, were having the sort of same impact on neighborhoods as public schools. And in some ways they were, in that schools were very central to sort of processes of sorting out a racial order. Catholic parishes in New Orleans remained integrated far longer than just about anything else in the city. But the sort of price or the compromise the church paid for implementing segregation within the parishes, which was fiercely contested, was by expanding Black parochial education. And that occurred in around the turn of the 20th century. But essentially the deal the church made was said, look, we'll invest in Black schools if Black residents accept segregated parishes. So a question, and this gets at a case that's very central to the current research I'm doing. Says, I believe it was a school protest that sent Gary Tyler to prison for many years. He was accused of shooting someone outside the school bus. He's been released from Angola, but there's a real question if he was a shooter. Do you know others who are imprisoned as a result of school protests? So excellent question. The event being referenced here occurred at Destrehan High School in St. Charles Parish in 1974. So I know there were certainly a number of instances in New Orleans and elsewhere in which students were arrested as a result of protest, often on sort of trumped up charges of disturbing the peace, inciting a riot, even if it was a peaceful protest. Gary's story is about the most dramatic I know in terms of retribution. There were some cases in North Carolina where students were imprisoned for quite some time tied to protest and vandalism. There's sadly other instances of students being shot, killed, or seriously injured in the context of protests during desegregation. So there's certainly some parallels to other cases. I think we're just about at time. Thank you all for coming. I really appreciated the questions, and I'm easy to track down online if anyone has further questions that they would like to follow up on. But thanks so much for joining me, and really appreciate the opportunity to share some of my work. So thank you all.